The poet who I have enjoyed discovering and reading the most in the last 5 years is the French poet Jacques Reda, who is still alive but in his early 80s. The tragic thing about Reda is that his work was omitted from many anthologies of French poetry, and particularly of French poetry translated into English. The very large Penguin Book of French Verse, 1850 to 1950, omitted him, and the problem is that only probably 5% of his poetry has been translated into English, and this is not necessarily the best poetry. The one exception to this is a book called Return to Calm, poemed by Jacques Reda, translated by Aaron Prévost, published by Host in America, but you can pick it up on the internet for £7 or £8. And this seems to me a huge concentration of his best work, although it was not a selected poems, it was originally simply one collection of his poems in French. And there are many more, but not a single word of these has ever been translated, and I think now probably never will be. I don't myself sadly possess the ability to translate to this level, and those that do seem not to translate anymore. And French poetry and the Francophone seems no longer to be something that English and American writers and poets are very interested in. There's a great obsession, perhaps an over-obsession with Apollinaire, and to some extent probably Nerval and Baudelaire, of course, but Reda has a particularly beautiful tone. He is a poet of great lyrical power. He is a poet of nostalgia. He writes about the environs of Paris, the backwaters, the disused rail yards, railway bridges, and he writes with an exquisite lyrical passion. It's very difficult to know how to present him because unless you've got a bilingual text in front of you, you can't really see the particular beauty of his power. Anyway, I will choose one poem from Return to Calm. I will choose a short poem because that way, hopefully, your interest will not wither. It's called Dark May, and I'll read the English version first and then the French original. At the garden's far end, the furry spider sang, and the May sun spun its web on the water. I listened to the surfeit of blue burn in the nettles, and a locomotive's animal breath keep watch over the god's solitude. Then from above a tree or within a wall's shadow, I was the hub, spokes and rim of the accelerating wheel. And if living its unhappiness, one feels it less, while lasting like an old moss wall under the clouds, always opening to the May sun one's dark cavity, nervous as a killer between the river and the path, shading flowers whose sylph-like stem prolongs a sky leg or child's leg in the apricot tree, which drifts now far from the gardens, far from the clouds. And this is the original. Mai sombre. Tout au fond du jardin chantait l'araignée à fourrure, et le soleil de mai tissait sa toile sur les eaux. J'écoutais le trop-plein de bleu brûlé dans les orties, et le souffle animal d'une locomotive veillait sur la solitude des dieux. Alors en haut d'un arbre ou dans l'ombre d'un mur, je fus le moyau, les rayons et le bord de la roue accélérant. Et si c'est un malheur de vivre, il est moins grand. Pour qui dure un vieux mur de mousse sous les nuages, ouvrant toujours sa cavité sombre au soleil de mai, nerveux comme un tueur entre le fleuve et le sentier, ombrageant des fleurs dont la tige aérienne prolonge une jambe de ciel, ou d'enfants dans l'abricotier qui dérive après son loin des jardins, loin des nuages. As I was reading that, I was suddenly struck by the influence of Mallarmé. Mallarmé is one of his most famous poems, is The Spinner. Mallarmé is, even if Reda is difficult, Mallarmé is virtually impossible to translate, and even for native French readers, sometimes even to understand. His compression was so great. There is a notice I was reading this, the mention of the sky as the blue, and this was a great obsession that Mallarmé had, and of course this is reflected in Monet's paintings, or perhaps the other way around. I don't know quite who influenced who. There was in this period, the great period of French writing and painting, when Monet and Manet and Cézanne were painting, and Mallarmé had his Tuesdays, and Paul Valéry went to those Tuesdays. This was a great tradition in French writing, and I don't think ever in England there has been such a concatenation or conflation of the written word and the graphic arts. I'll end with a poem which is in the Blood Axe New French Poetry, edited by David Kelly and Jean Calfa. These poems are not included in the Return to Calm. They're from an elegiac calendar, un calendrier élégique, which was published by Fatima Organa in 1990. It's a series of poems about the year. I will simply read January, which I think is not just the first, but is the best. This is the English version. What I love in winter is the naked thrust of branches against a sky which is sombre or softly lit with turquoise, pink turning purple, with orange or greens and greys, pale and murky, creating against the black a striking contrast, suggesting a writing whose sense is hidden, whose indelible ink imprints upon the chaste horizon the obscure poem of the forest. Yet that is but an old image. Let's find another. Think that the colourless, motionless branch is rising like a suffering, imploring arm, or twisting in the wind to recount its pain. In truth, winter is the most perfect of seasons, in which each branch fills with precision its form, and is no more than a branch repeating its perfect presence between the sleeping depths of daylight and the unrumbling torrent of the clouds. No, not the slightest thrust, not even quiet, no hidden lesson, no presage of the future, but there upright in the seemingly uninhabited air, devoid as sometimes one is of hope and the images. And this is the original Janvier. Ce que j'aime en hiver, c'est l'élan nu des branches contre un ciel sombre ou très doucement lumineux de turquoise, de rose un peu mauve, d'orange, ou de vert et de gris pâle, fulgineux, qui font avec ce noir un saisissant contraste. On imagine une écriture au sens secret dont l'encre indélébile imprime sur le chaste horizon le poème obscur de la forêt. Mais ce n'est qu'une vieille image, une autre encore de croire que la branche inerte sans couleur se dresse comme un bras de malheureux implore ou se tord sous le vent pour dire sa douleur. En vérité, l'hiver est la saison parfaite où chaque branche emplit sa forme exactement et n'est rien d'autre qu'une branche qui répète sa présence accomplie entre le fond dormant du jour et le torrent sans rumeur des nuages. Non, pas même un élan, ni la tranquillité, aucun enseignement caché, pas de présage, mais là, droit dans l'air qui semble inhabité, pur comme on l'est parfois d'espérance et d'image. This was, I think, probably my favourite poem of Reda's, but what is so unique and unbelievably splendid is that virtually no work from a 50-year writing career is much less good than that. They are all incredibly, uniquely profound. They have this marvellous rhetorical sense that English poetry doesn't seem to have reached. There is an absolute resonance which goes right back, not just through French poetry, but from the great French dramatists like Racine. And Reda seems to manage to bring together all these flows of passion, of nostalgia, of lyricism, of personal narrative. His ego never superimposes itself. He's very much an observing eye, but not cold and clinical, absolutely and totally an emotional rapport with the reader, which is indescribably powerful. And I can only hope, I don't think in my lifetime, I'm 71, but hopefully somebody will start some project to actually translate at least some larger portions of Reda's work than the very pitiful amount that is actually available. There is a series of books in prose by Reda as well. The most famous and the only one, there's only 2 translated so far into English. One, the most important one, is The Ruins of Paris, Les Ruines de Paris. And I've read this book both in French and in English several times, and I find that however many times I go back to it, I still find new things. There is simply nothing like this in English. To some extent, Reda is a flaneur, like Baudelaire, a stroller, walking round the suburbs, and particularly the outer suburbs of Paris, then returning to the centre, the hub, the centre of the spider's web perhaps. All these things, all these images crowd together, and yet when Reda paints them suddenly, it's like watching a rainbow. All the colours are distinct, but the rainbow itself, this wonderful aura in the sky, is always there. I can only hope that someone with a better knowledge of French than I have, my son said I sound like an Englishman, well educated but still an Englishman reading French, and I'm sure this is sadly true, but I can only hope others try to read as I do and enjoy as much as I have the work of Jacques Reda, a much underestimated poet in English.